Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Reimagining Childhood Studies webinar. We're really pleased you were able to join us for this first webinar. We have an exciting panel of speakers and a Q&A to follow. But in order to start, I'm going to pass over to one of my co-organizers, Spyrou, to give us a welcome and introduction. Spyros, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's our great pleasure to welcome you to this first event of our webinar series, Reimagining Childhood Studies. My name is Spyrou. Together with Rachel, you just heard her talk, Rachel Rosen and Sarada Balagopalan. We're organizing this series starting today with our introductory event, which will set the ground for the subsequent webinars. And I would like to give you a bit of the background of this initiative and our rationale for organizing it. As some of you may be aware, I, together with Rachel Rosen and Cook, edited a book titled Reimagining Childhood Studies, which we also chose to be the name for this webinar series. Sharon Basel contributed an excellent chapter to the book, and that initial collaboration with the book is what brought us again together to organize these webinars. At one level, the book was an effort on our part to address our collective frustration with childhood studies, a field that we work in, appreciate very much and would like to see flourish. We wanted to question some of the field's prevailing assumptions and overcome its fixations on particular figures of the child. And at another level, we wanted to also move beyond critique and to contribute towards the field's reimagining, though it quickly became obvious to us that it is easier to critique a field than reimagine it. From the very beginning, we envisioned the task of reimagining childhood studies as part of a broader discussion about the field's future, which would have to extend beyond the book's publication. And we also felt that such a discussion would have to maintain a critical, reflexive, and collective character. And it is in this spirit that we organize this series of conversations centered around the idea of reimagining, with a view to continuing this project of reinvigorating debate within the field and opening it up to new ways of thinking. In our concluding paragraph of the introductory chapter of the book, we laid out our perspective and vision of reimagining childhood studies, which I will quote here for you, because I think it captures well what it is we are trying to do with this series of webinars. And I quote, as a dynamic scholarly field and practice, childhood studies has much to offer to the human sciences and beyond. Overcoming the need to own the child need not weaken the field's intellectual and political project. On the contrary, we feel that such a move might re-energize it through cross-fertilization. Being open and receptive to dialogue with what lies beyond, to borrow and integrate, but to also offer and contribute, is not only a sign of intellectual maturity for a field, but also a bold affirmation for its raison d'etre. The project of reimagining childhood studies, no doubt looms larger than this attempt in reimagining childhood studies. We're referring to the book here, wherein the contributions, individually and collectively, strive to reach beyond extant boundaries of thought and conception to venture elsewhere. In the end, we feel each of us faces the challenge in our own ways, our own spheres, our own work, to move past the child without recklessly leaving childhood behind. Recognizing the limits of any attempt at reimagining a field and the sense of humility that comes with attempting to do so, we nevertheless feel that at this particular moment in childhood studies trajectory, such attempts may provide impetus for new explorations, and not just any explorations, but ones that matter for the historical times in which we live, end of quote. The pandemic and the almost complete lack of opportunities to meet with colleagues face-to-face in conferences and seminars was also an added factor in us deciding to take this initiative. We felt that these webinars could bring the community of childhood studies scholars from across the world closer together, including taking up the affordances of online technologies as an opportunity to redefine issues of common concern in ways which contest and extend the current political economy and Eurocentrism of knowledge production. We hope that together we can reflect on what the reimagining of childhood studies entails and how to move forward. Now, following today's event, 3 other webinars are scheduled for the next few months. Each webinar will explore a different theme, issue, or concept, which we hope will offer food for thought and insight critical debate. The first webinar will focus on the concept of slow violence, the second one on the notion of refusal, and the third one will explore liberalism's erasures. The initial title was Beyond Liberalism. We changed that, and now the new title for the third webinar, the last one, would be Liberalism's Erasures. We will send out announcements for each of these events at a later point once we have specific dates and confirmed speakers. For today's event, we have 3 distinguished commentators who will reflect on the question of reimagining childhood studies. We have Professor Sharon Basel from the Australian National University, whose talk is titled Beyond Agency, What Can Childhood Studies Contribute to Theorizing and Addressing Inter- and Intragenerational Inequality? We have Professor Lucia Rabello de Castro from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, who will talk about generating the child in childhood studies in the Global South, encroachments and challenges. And Professor Tatek Abebe from NTNU in Norway, whose talk is titled Reflections on Children's Education and Futures. Each of them will speak for about 15 minutes. And this part of the event will be coordinated by Rachel. The remaining time will be devoted to questions and answers. And for purposes of efficiency, we will only use the Q&A function for questions and comments. If you would like to address your question to a specific speaker, please mention their name. Also, it will be good if you write your name and affiliation when you post your question. The Q&A session will be coordinated by Sarada. Please also note that the webinar is being recorded. We plan to make these webinars available to those who cannot attend and potentially create an archive for students and scholars engaged with the project of reimagining the field. And Rachel will now take over and proceed to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Wonderful. It's really marvelous to be with everyone here today. And I have the honor of introducing our speakers. Our first speaker is Sharon Basel, who's a professor of public policy at the Australian National University. She is Director of Gender Equity and Diversity at the Crawford School of Public Policy, where she heads the Children's Policy Center and the Poverty and Inequality Research Center. Her research interests, as likely you all know, revolve around the issues of social justice and human rights, focusing on social policy for children, the gendered and generational dimensions of poverty, and gender inequality. Sharon has a strong interest in research methods, and she's published widely on ethics and research with children. She is editor of In Focus, Poverty, and a member of the editorial board of Childhood. In 2019, Sharon was named as one of the Australian Financial Review's Women of Influence, and certainly that she is. We really look forward to hearing from her and her talk entitled Beyond Agency, What Can Childhood Studies Contribute to Theorizing and Addressing Intergenerational Inequality? Over to you, Sharon.
Rachel, thank you so much for that introduction. And if people could just bear with me for one moment, I will share my screen. Rachel, can you see the screen? Great. The title of my presentation has changed just a little, as sometimes happens between imagining what a presentation may be and the actual presentation, but what I'm going to talk about is still very similar. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this webinar series, and Rachel, Spyros and Sarada, thank you for organising what I think will be a fantastic series of events. The book that Spyros, Rachel and Dan have edited is a genuinely important one, and one that I think will be a landmark in childhood studies. So good evening from Australia, where I'm joining you from Ngunnawal land, which has never been ceded, and I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the land that I'm on, and pay my respects to leaders past, present and emerging. I want to focus, as the title Beyond Agency still suggests, a little on the concept of agency, which has just been so central to childhood studies, and then to think a little bit beyond agency. And of course, it is the thinking beyond agency that provides the starting point for reimagining childhood studies. One of the interesting things I think about the idea of agency is that it has entered such a range of vocabularies. It's certainly been influential in our field of study, but it's also been influential beyond. A quick Google search shows how the use of the term has become so widespread, and often in ways that feel a little bit like sloganeering. This website from a government site in Australia is typical of the ways in which agency is so often used. The agentic, and the website states, and I'll just quote this, the agentic characteristic is about ensuring that children have voice in their learning, their ideas and interests initiate, support and extend possibilities. The end of the quote on the site. But of course, schools and education systems remain for the most part extremely hierarchical. Children's voices are carefully managed and learning is often highly political. And yet this language of agency is so widely used. As Spyros, Rachel and Dan point out in their introduction to the volume, agency has been valorised, sometimes to the point of fetish. Not only, I would suggest, in childhood studies, but in the fields we research and seek to influence. But as Spyros, Rachel and Dan point out, this bias has often prevented or at least placed constraints around other forms of analysis. Agency itself is a powerful and complex concept. It is closely associated with empowerment and with the exercise of at least some level of power. Naila Kabir reminds us that it is not only making, but also acting on life choices and being aware of alternatives that is at the heart of agency. It is the ability to define goals and to act on them in ways that are linked to processes of taking power over one's life. Few children exercise such agency, not because children are incapable of determining and taking a course of action, we know that's not the case, but because structures of power and privilege and political, economic and social hierarchies prevent children, like many adults, from doing so. And this is especially constraining for children who live within contexts of disadvantage and poverty. If we take Prout and James' important definition of children as active participants, I think we begin to see where some parts of our field of study have become stuck in something of a conceptual quagmire. And here I want to pull apart the idea of children constructing their own social lives and of determining them as a means of us moving in new directions. To me, construction speaks to the ways in which children decide on their action within certain circumstances and constraints, the way they contribute to social and interpersonal interactions, and the ways in which children influence their social and material worlds. And here we see that childhood can be co-constructed by children with their societies and in contexts of culture, time, and place. Determination, as I thought about this presentation, speaks to me about something closer to exercising agency and power, making choices and acting on them. And an issue here is not children's capacity to make choices, which has been such a focus and sometimes an obsession of childhood studies, but their ability to do so within existing power structures. What we need, I suggest, is greater attention to those power structures. And of course, I say this as a political sociologist. Other disciplines will point childhood scholars in different directions. And ideally, that will bring the richness of multi- and transdisciplinary approaches to our collective field of study. I just wanted to share with you a couple of examples from my own research about what we might think is agency and what might be analysed as an example of such. So first, I wanted to share with you Joey's story. I first met Joey when she was 11. Her dad wasn't on the scene and her mum worked 2 jobs. Joey looked after the house most of the time. She did the housework and she looked after her younger brother and sister. Her mum was trying to develop a new relationship with a guy that she had met a couple of months earlier. And there were 2 younger children, Joey's brother and sister. Joey's young brother had epilepsy and needed a great deal of care. Joey made a lot of decisions within her family. As I said, she looked after her brother and sister on her own regularly. She cleaned the house. She helped out in her mum's boyfriend's business. She called on neighbours from time to time when she needed some help. And she had both responsibilities and a great deal of autonomy over her life. When I asked her how she felt about looking after her brother and sister so often, she explained that she didn't like it, but she did it because she loved them. The image that you see on your screen is not a picture that Joey drew of her life, but a picture she drew of what she imagined life could be like. And she explained that sometimes she just wanted to be a child and to be able to play. What Joey had in mind when she talked about wanting to be a child, I think, was not the agentic child of childhood studies. And to have her life understood and explained to others through the lens of agency would have been to miss the mark and to misrepresent what was important to her and the challenges she faced. Similarly, in Indonesia, in research that I've been doing with Angie Bexley and Clara Siagian, young boys who took part in our research often looked like active child agents who made choices and acted on their own. And indeed, they did contribute powerfully to their social worlds. They were often economically autonomous and they contributed economically to their families. But all of this was within the context and constrained by poverty, discrimination, and marginalisation, within social hierarchies and structures of power and patterns of exclusion and inclusion. So again, agency doesn't quite explain what these boys faced, although they looked as though they were exercising agency. As I said, much of my research is focused on children's lives and indeed the lives of people, regardless of their age, in contexts of poverty. And that poverty is structural, acting like a wall that prevents people from moving too far forward. And while people often demonstrate incredible strength and resilience in the context of poverty, the pieces of that wall cannot be dislodged through agency alone, unless it's accompanied by serious structural change. So what I'd like to focus on for the part of the presentation that's left is to share some ideas about how childhood studies can build on the strong foundations in place and draw on analytic lenses from beyond our field of study. And I particularly want to explore how we can better understand childhoods in the context of inequality and injustice. And of course, there is a normative element to my intentions here. It's not only understanding, but social change that I would like to provoke. And so I posed 3 questions. How can we build on the important contributions of childhood studies around the value of children's experiences, perspectives, and priorities? And here I'm going to suggest that standpoint theory offers a great deal. How can we uncover structures of power that shape individual children's lives, that shape social groups and societies? And here I suggest the potential contribution of intersectionality. And finally, how can we draw on children's rights frameworks or children's human rights frameworks in ways that avoid extremism, either cultural relativism or universalism in their extremes? And how can we avoid what I'm calling proceduralism? So if we move beyond agency, where do we move to? While representation of the agentic child is arguably not helpful, the now well-established place within childhood studies of children's knowledge and experiences is valuable, I would argue. While research with children has been influential and is now widespread, we do need to move beyond the trope of children's voices. A more powerful theoretical lens may be feminist standpoint theory, and this has already, of course, been used by some leading scholars in our field. Most valuably, standpoint theory brings to the forefront the ways in which power plays out in children's lives. Informed by feminist challenges to the taken for granted acceptedness of certain knowledge claims, standpoint theory positions such claims and their justification as part of the world we seek to understand, while acknowledging the criticisms and controversies around standpoint theory. It has value in uncovering the ways in which power relations and the exercise of power shapes both experiences and representations of the social world. This recognition is especially powerful when we are seeking to understand the way children engage with, are shaped by, and shape their social worlds, within which power is largely exercised by adults, or perhaps, as we should always remind ourselves, specific groups of adults. Vygotsky, I think, has summarised this well in describing standpoint theory as our position within society, which provides a means of giving less powerful members a way of presenting a different reality. Intersectionality reveals the ways in which an individual's social characteristics intersect to shape one's position, one's privilege, and one's experience of the world. Intersectionality has historically focused on privileges or underprivileges associated with race and with gender, but has been expanded to include a range of characteristics, including age. Intersectional analysis is neither reductionist nor additive, but it reveals the multifaceted nature of injustice, or, reframed as May notes, it expressly aims to unsettle such injustice and to pursue multifaceted forms of justice. In doing so, intersectionality engages in matrix analysis, highlighting how lived identities, structural systems, sites of marginalisation, forms of power and modes of resistance intersect in dynamic and shifting ways. The starting point here is the individual, and here the focus is on ethical individualism, whereby treatment of individual human beings, regardless of age, matters, and analytic individualism, whereby understanding individual experience, privilege, and position illuminates broader patterns of power and justice. This is not to suggest ontological individualism, and the aim of intersectional analysis ultimately is to understand broad patterns of power and privilege. This may be especially useful to our thinking about both the position of children and about childhood as both a socially constructed concept, but also reflecting that it is a particular life stage that plays out within the context of culture, or more often cultures plural, socioeconomic structures, legal systems, and both place and time. And useful in moving analysis beyond tropes of agency, social construction of childhood, and multiple childhoods, without losing the value that a complex interpretation of those concepts may bring. And finally, I just wanted to reflect briefly on children's rights and interrogate their value to analyses of inequality and injustice. One of the striking aspects of much children's rights discourse is the dehistoricization and the decontextualization that often occurs. Children's rights sit within the international human rights framework rather than stand alone in a way that infantizes them. Thinking about children's rights, or I should say thinking not about children's rights, but thinking about the human rights of children, as Judith Enyu would have reminded us, enables us to uncover both the Western origins and tendencies of human rights, but also the myriad ways in which human rights have been used to challenge power and privilege, including challenging Western power and privilege. Useful here to our thinking is work by Donnelly and by Engel, Marian Levitt, which seeks, in the case of Donnelly, to find a place between the dogma and extremism of absolute relativism and absolute universalism, or in the case of Engel, Mary and Levitt, understanding processes of vernacularization, whereby global ideas are not simply rejected or adopted, embraced or imposed, but circulate and are appropriated and contested within cultural contexts. This enables us to understand processes of isomorphism, but also the ways in which rights talk and rights action shape both children's lives and the institutions of childhood. Importantly, we can move beyond tropes of Western imperialism and of cultural relativism, and it may help in both illuminating and moving beyond the proceduralism that has accompanied children's rights, whereby the focus is not justice or equity or addressing privilege, underprivilege or maldistribution, but simply ticking a box. So in Reimagining Childhood Studies, I have not, I think, been particularly theoretically ambitious. I'm drawing on well-established theories and theories that some of our colleagues are already using. But in wondering how childhood studies can better enable us to illuminate the causes of inequality, inter and intragenerational, and on the basis of not only age, but gender, race, class, and so on, there is an ambition to not merely illuminate, but to address and perhaps redress injustice through ethical and analytical individualism and structural analysis of the drivers and patterns of power and privilege. The theoretical richness of standpoint theory and intersectionality, both drawn from feminist theorizing, may enable us to move beyond agency without losing the centrality of the child and of children as social groups, and to engage in structural analyses of power and privilege in all their complexity. Interrogating how rights may play out in the vernacular and how universality might interplay with culture may enable analysis and normative positions without imperialism. Finally, as childhood studies continues to evolve and mature as a field of study, there is no single reimagining. And this is one of the most exciting and powerful elements of Spyros, Rachel and Dan's book. And I'm sure it will be true of this webinar series. The question, I think, is how we reimagine. The question of how we reimagine not only reflects where we come from individually and collectively as scholars of childhood, but also our own methodological, epistemological, theoretical, and indeed normative positions. And it's that exciting combination that I think will allow us to reimagine our field in ways that are theoretically challenging and practically important. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sharon, for that brilliant talk and development of some theoretical frames for helping the field move beyond the question of agency. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions for the speakers, you can post them in the Q&A section, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. You may have to hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen and the question will get posted there. We'll be taking all questions at the end of the speakers' presentations, pardon me. It's now my absolute pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Lucia Rabello de Castro, who is a professor of childhood and youth in the Institute of Psychology at the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. We were saying at the beginning, as we met before we opened up the webinar, how wonderful it is to actually meet people. And for me, it's for the first time. So for me, it's been lovely to meet Lucia and working on these webinars. She has a distinguished career. She's been the founder and chair and present scientific director for the Interdisciplinary Research on Contemporary Child and Youth in Brazil. She's the president of the Research Committee on Sociology of Childhood of the International Sociological Association, and the chief editor of Desidades, an electronic journal on Latin American childhood and youth. So a formidable thinker in childhood studies. She's published widely in Portuguese, Spanish, French, and English with a focus on children and youth's social and political participation and on decolonial epistemologies. The title of Lucia's talk is Generating the Child in Childhood Studies in the Global South, Encroachments and Challenges. Over to you, Lucia.
Thank you very much, Rachel. And good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here. And I thank very much Spyros, Rachel, and Sarada for the very kind invitation to be here. I think it's an opportunity to share thoughts and effects so that our horizon of hopes and ideas, especially in this very difficult moment that we are going through, can be refreshed. Hannah Arendt once said that the faculty of imagination can bring us close to the specific darkness of the human heart and the peculiar density of reality. So to imagine allows one to understand, and for Arendt, understanding through imagination differently from knowing is what counts to make this inhospitable world home. So, following Arendt and taking the cue from the convocation of the seminar to reimagine the field of childhood studies, my contribution here will attempt to engage in interrogating our present knowledge accounts for our present knowledge so that we can sort of go deeper in the dense reality of childhood in the South. I would begin by interrogating certain premises which structure this field of knowledge and in what ways knowledge thus produced reflect such vantage points. In the book edited by Spyrou, Rosen and Cook, Reimagining Childhood Studies, it is reckoned that the researcher invariably takes part in the research assemblage, and I quote, not simply as a reflexive figure capable of critically assessing her positionality and biases, but as an entangled and co-constitutive presence in the assemblage which produces knowledge, end of quote. And here they mean physical presence, theoretical and philosophical assumptions, emotions and desires. So I would argue, however, that also co-constitutive or research events remain more non-transparent aspects of the researcher's positionality, quite inaccessible through sheer self-reflection. One of them being the localization of a research event within a geopolitical framework. By this, I mean the issue of how research events are made possible, how they emerge, how they are named, conceptualized, found to be plausible within the amplest structures of knowledge, authorization, production, circulation, and consumption in the political economy of knowledge of the present capitalistic international order. To take note of these ample structures imply in accounting for the legitimating and coercive aspects of knowledge, which tend to obscure rather than highlight the conditions of possibility of research events. This means that which research events are made possible rather than others has to do with the hegemonizing power of specific localizations within the global network of scientific knowledge production. The North-South divide has received manifold criticisms on a variety of grounds, about which I won't have the time to deal with now. From a decolonial perspective, however, this divide stands for a useful geopolitical framework to describe a cartographic coherence among nations which share a certain set of conditions, which I cite some. For instance, first, past problems such as colonialism, economic and territorial exploitation. Second, recent but maladroit endeavors to overcome these problems through economic development, national independence, modern democracy. And third, contemporary ordeals like to be part of a global economy with its impingements of reproducing internally more social and economic inequalities. As such, the use of the notion South as opposed to the North addresses this major conundrum of global capitalism that, if I may use a metaphor, put us all on the same boat, although some are dining on the deck, whilst others are toiling in the galleys, so that the experience of the journey or the truth of the journey can be totally distinct for these two groups. Even if grossly overlooking the complexity of the world global scenario and the differentials among and within nations, I argue here for the strategic relevance of such a geopolitical frame, North-South, as it articulates and connects the structural pathways in the flow of surplus capital and affluence with the international division of scientific labor in childhood studies. When researchers in the South interrogate about childhood and children, in the North, this question would sound like, how is the child possible? Their research agenda is already set within pre-given conditions and determinants of how research assemblages should be put up. The subaltern location of research events in the South becomes of paramount significance as both epistemic distances and approximations have to be worked out as research practice develop. The adherence to an internationalized research agenda stands as a requirement to approximate the generation of the child in the South to the orthodoxies of mainstream scholarship. This demands a tremendous effort, and I refer here not only to the learning and the mastery of conceptual and theoretical frameworks, but I include an overall and deep compromise with a certain way to see research issues. This means reading one's own reality and its social demands through the lens of already given conditions of discursive and epistemic practices. Pauline Otunji, philosopher of Benin, Africa, has purposefully coined the term extraversion to tap the condition, both subjective as well as collective, of exteriorizing the search for knowledge. According to Otondi, this condition leads irrevocably to the impoverishment, the disappearance, and the repression of other local knowledges and relational ontologies. The logic of extraversion generates a logic of local marginalization. For scholars in the South, the structural conditions of research events lead to a process of integration in international scholarship, notwithstanding the ravaging effects of exteriorization and homogenization in the knowledge practices thus produced. It is on this account that the Argentinian semiotician Mignolo has urged for a delinking process geared to shifting the geography of universal reason, which has made the knowing subject disincarnated and territorially disembedded. African intellectuals like Mafege and Okere have accordingly pointed at the process of endogenization of knowledge, which would demand stepping back from the convocation of being somewhere else than here and of knowing as a rootless commitment to anywhere. Thus, a key question would be how to read and understand social realities in the South, if not trapped within the dynamics of this double bind of distancing and approximations that concur to a positionality of epistemic disconnection with the world around. To construct epistemologically relevant links to the local realities can lead to quite paradoxical situations and impasses. On one side, researchers are ever summoned by the immediacy and the gravity of social demands concerning the dense reality of children in the South, such as those of child hunger, adolescent assassination, children's sexual exploitation, family and child social and economic abandonment. Against the backdrop of such urgent issues, the construction of a research agenda in the South can responsively embrace these issues in the scope of a morally concerned agenda. This prioritizes focusing the problems that befall children and adolescents in the view of informing public policies. Actually, this has been a growing research investment as researchers are confronted with mounting inequalities caused by neoliberal state policies. However, by doing so, local realities seem to be pigeonholed and understood along the linear historical narrative of modernization, development, and globalization, so that ultimate and desirable end states seem very clearly given. As abhorrent moral conditions where children live and grow in the South are assumed as key aspects of research events, more difficult it becomes to read these local realities, divested from the paradigmatic normative framework of childhood as put forward by northern countries. Less efforts will be directed to advance more nuanced understandings about how these particular conditions work to generate childhood, if there is one. Paradoxically, the rendering up to the clamor of problems that children face ultimately unfolds a research agenda that is conservative as far as the problematization of the mainstream theoretical and conceptual apparatus of childhood generation is concerned. Social problems seen as needing urgent remedial intervention and correction come to be regarded as bizarre instances of lack, backwardness, barbarism, or even uncivilized traditions. In this case, what is also reaffirmed is a universally valid conceptualization of childhood generation, a Euro-centered historical account of children, families, and history. As it appears, an epistemologically driven closeness and intimacy with local realities demands more than simply empathically packing up social problems as research events. Pressed by ethical commitments to remedy unbearably shameful inequalities, research events that take place in this other part of the globe, the South, can overlook both to address less visible geopolitical determinacies of these events, as well as how it is that local conditions and particularities can feed to generate childhoods. The agonistic issue of the researcher's ethical commitment to her local reality, especially for researchers in the South, cannot be resolved by unproblematically surrendering either to received knowledge or to the urgency to remedy, moved by what can be politically useful. I conclude that the generation of a research agenda in the South that contributes epistemologically to childhood studies remains a challenge. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lucia, for a really stimulating presentation. I think you've raised some really important questions about taking into account highly uneven geopolitical relations and taking forward Mignolo's calls for epistemic delinking, and at the same time building local linkages or understandings of local particularities. So thank you very much. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions for the speakers, please do post them in the Q&A section, and we encourage you to write your own affiliation there when you post the question. I'd now like to move on to our third and final speaker. I'm so pleased to introduce Tatek Abebe, who's a professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, where he convenes the MPhil in Childhood Studies. His teaching and research interests are at the intersections of childhood studies and development studies, with an emphasis on how young people are affected by and contribute to the transformation of sociocultural and political economic environments that they inhabit. It's again a pleasure to meet Tatek online here in this forum. I teach his materials, and so it's wonderful to hear from him and that he could be here today. You likely know him. He's the director of the Council for Development of Social Science Research in Africa's 2017 Child and Youth Institute, founder and coordinator of the Nordic Network of African Childhood and Youth Research, an international advisory board member of Childhood, Children's Geographies, and FENIA, the International Journal of Geography, and is well published in these fields. The title of Tatek's talk today is Reflections on Reimagining Children's Education and Futures. Over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. Do you hear me? Hello, everyone. Thank you to all the organizers for this opportunity to participate in this Reimagining Childhood Studies conversation. I want to start by congratulating the authors and editors of this book. It's a very interesting book, and it's a book that, in my view, represents exciting and intriguing times for childhood studies. And I truly enjoyed reading it. And in reading it twice, first to endorse it, and then to prepare for this webinar, I realized how much childhood studies have begun to change course. And the book is curated in ways that make us see the future directions of childhood studies. Its author synthesized diverse arrays of contentions and collectively raising new ontological, philosophical, theoretical, ethical and political questions and critiques. They also provide jumping off points for future debates. So the book holds a lot of ambitions. And in my talk, I want to use the book's ontological and political ambitions to reflect what it might mean to reimagine children's education and futures. This implies envisaging what children's education could be, seeing education in the future as intimately woven and exploring what they mean for each other and for childhood. I think that childhood and the purpose of education are perhaps two of the most misunderstood aspects of modernity. So I want to use the book's invitation to reimagine childhood studies to highlight some questions I have about reimagining education as community formation and the kind of futures that this might require and engender. And in doing so, I reflect on the philosophy of education and childhood primarily in Africa, as well as on topics at the nexus of history, political economy, and culture. One example of an African philosophy, an African humanist philosophy that embeds interdependent existence and that can be helpful to understand how education and the future are interconnected is Ubuntu. Ubuntu represents the world views of indigenous Black populations of sub-Saharan Africa, transmitted from generation to generation through observation, experience, language, and arts. So this widely acknowledged concept, I am what I am because of who we all are, indicates that relationality is at the core of what it means to be a human being. Ubuntu it's about how we need other human beings to be human. It's also about socialization, how we would not know how to think, walk, speak, or behave unless we have learned it from others. Ubuntu suggested that like every member of the family and community, children develop personhood through other persons, which means that they must prize solidarity and communal and harmonious relationship with others. This emphasis on the community over the individual does not reject the individual, but implies that the two are co-creators, interdependent and mutually sustaining. The ethic of Ubuntu reminds us of the relational ontology in which people, materials, practices, and human nature interaction are intermeshed. It resonates with how, for example, the traditional practices of assigning social responsibility to children are highly compatible with the goals of education in Africa and elsewhere. At best, it can serve as a context for learning about cooperation, environment, health, and nutrition. African children's involvement in family work is construed as a dimension of intelligence. And here I want to mention the work of Bam and Samanan. Whereas socially distributed caregiving practices are strategies of cultivating interpersonal agency. So here I want to point out that learning is mediated socio-culturally and that we need to recognize how childhood is part of a complex web of culture and history. In childhood studies, the notion of cultural imperialism has been invoked as a warning that knowledge and practices of international development, and this in many ways include the global development goals and education for all initiatives, are in fact historically specific to the Western world and do not necessarily reflect the realities of children elsewhere. Post-colonial scholars have proposed the term epistemological violence to highlight hegemonic cultural interpretations of scientific knowledge that construct the other as problematic or inferior, with implicit or explicit negative consequences for the other. Robert Serper argues that the institutionalized public system of education that draw on competitive values, on competitive capitalist values, not only promote an extractive definition of success, but also inflict violence by stigmatizing unschooled children as incomplete and incompetent. Arguably, schooling produces future workers who are servants of capitalism. It also produces subjects who are in many ways rendered a surplus population that is not necessary for the global economy. And there's some interesting work, recent work done by Nicola Ansel and her colleagues on this topic. The future working child is meant to be schooled but not educated, so that she can be deployed into labor whenever needed. However, she is often dismissed and replaced or sits idle, hoping for fitting opportunities to arise that match her ever-increasing aspirations. This reality has crystallized in the worldwide problem of schooled unemployed youth who scramble for precarious jobs. It also highlights how schooling stimulates unattainable aspirations and what Deborah Durham calls elusive adulthoods. I want to link the problem of unemployment and elusive adulthoods, whereby young people struggle to achieve their socioeconomic aspirations, with this academicization of education. Schooling represents the academicization of education, a reductive practice that contributes to the narrowing of knowledge. Having said that, I also want to ask which modes of knowing and becoming are erased by the universal promotion of schooling? What alternative futures of childhood have been displaced? Which meaningful versions of childhood have not been envisioned? And why not we imagine education that does not take children out of community forming economies? I've elsewhere argued that schooling alienates children from rural futures and the physical environment, contributing to a decline in their skills for resource conservation and environmental management. This is not only because children have limited access to land as they come of age, but they are also learning about land in a socio-historical context that is characterized by rapid population growth, land grabbing, deforestation, and environmental degradation. The destruction of the physical environment heightens young people's sense of displacement from the future. And Syndicates argues that this displacement is a consequence of communities' insertion, rural communities' insertion into a capitalist system that separates economic production from social reproduction. The ruptures in social reproduction require solutions in development, in the very projects of development and schooling, by reorienting educational institutions as sites for reimagining learning. Given that the promises of education for a better future are not met, it is time to rethink education outside the neoliberal paradigm and de-link schooling from market-driven requirements of the capitalist economy. And this in many ways presupposes moving away from the discourses of rights to education to instead inscribing rights in education. Rights in education activate a politics that attaches intrinsic value to life and realign the purpose of education with the overall purpose of life. Unlike the right to education, which is about access, rights in education attend to the basic social, economic, cultural, and gender needs and subjectivities of learners. It defines schooling curricula upward to include educational goals such as social justice, citizenship, diversity, values, learning in a global context, and sustainable development. Greta Thunberg's climate activism and Fridays for Future initiatives demonstrate these concerns linked to the rights of the future generation and sustainability. And they ask this profound question: why study for a future if there is no future? Which to me is a question that evokes ideas of existentialism, of deep interdependence, of communities of care, of Ubuntu. Similarly, Nobel Peace Prize winner Malala Yousafzai's advocacy for education that resonates with girls' aspiration is another example of how young people are performing an educational task for their communities that adultist educational structures of instrumental schooling fail to do. So given these and other struggles for climate justice and educational justice, it is time for childhood studies to engage with, to re-engage with the inseparable questions of childhood and education, acknowledging children as future makers, as Spyrou called it in a recent editorial for childhood, and considering how to enable children's role in education for community formation. I also want to envision education against the backdrop of the relational term suggested by reimagining childhood studies, with framing around intergenerationality. Education involves an intergenerational transfer of knowledge, values, and skills, but it also needs to be a reciprocal and co-generational process. By co-generational, I mean a move away from the hierarchy of adults as teachers and children as learners, to instead fostering horizontal educational practice with children and adults as co-learners. There is also a need for a shift from looking at intergenerational learning within families to harness the potential of extra-familial places of intergenerational encounters as important sites for learning. And perhaps here an example of extra-familiar site of learning is education in spiritual and or religious contexts. By spiritual learning, I mean the metaphysical appreciation of the significance of traditions and affirmation of life as a powerful culturally motivating force. What it means to be an educated person or a critical learning subject in these settings differs from how the uni-generational model of education views the learner. Islamic education, for instance, has a process-oriented approach where learning implies effort, pain, and suffering. In the age-old educational practices of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, the child is viewed as spiritually endowed and as possessing capacities that in certain ways exceed those of adults. Yet doing away with religion as part of the Western secularization project instigates educational structures that miss out on spiritual sensibilities that allow children to navigate the moral and emotional landscape of their societies. And I raise this point not just because spiritual learning enables children to develop meaningful and satisfying lives. It can also be a site for intergenerational relating and sharing of extra-familial knowledge. So a relational view on education is critical to understand the intergenerational dimensions of learning in interrelated spheres of life. It includes embodied learning in everyday activities of travel, play, and work. However, it also entails problem solving and transformative education, which are predicated on designing programs nested in progressive ideas of education. So what if we foster intergenerational learning where children actively acquire skills alongside other generations inside and outside schools? What if education supports shared community conceptions of a good life that are culturally enriching and morally and ethically justifiable? What if educational policies anticipate children's future not to unfold in a linear sequence, but rather as an interlocking of pasts, presents, and futures? I raise these questions not to answer them here, obviously, but to invite future discussions and debates in childhood studies regarding education. So to finish, I just want to point out that transformative education requires also the revitalization of knowledge systems that are excluded or forgotten, and the reactivation of educational futures that were rendered meaningless by colonial conditions. Christine Cheney's insightful chapter on decolonization invites us to contest what constitutes knowledge, allowing us to reimagine knowledge production, representation, and power relations in ways that question hegemonic cultural assumptions on childhood and how to engage children. Decolonization is about critical awareness of what type of education is deployed for childhood and how, as well as how education is used for promoting positive social change. Yet, it also means going beyond the inclusion of local knowledge in education or in mainstream childhood research. As much as we can learn from present and historical indigenous communities, the challenge for childhood studies is how to turn the gaze back onto the ideal childhood as part of such a project. We need to continue to scrutinize childhood studies' culpability in the reproduction of the constructed, agentic, autonomous, and vocal child, as well as of Western pedagogy in the education of children in the global South. However, this question needs to be asked alongside what the reproduction of similar ideology does for childhood and education as community formation in the Western world as well. And this is necessary to avoid producing lopsided answers that conceal problematic symptoms of Western childhood. It's also required because so-called Western children will be dealing with mutations of current interconnected educational, economic, political, and ecological crises alongside their Southern counterparts in the future.
Thank you so much, Tatek. That was an incredibly brilliant talk, and you've raised so many important questions. And it was personal for me. I really liked the ways in which you brought together childhood and the purpose of education in terms of reimagining education as a community formation. And I particularly appreciated how you discuss learning as something that should be mediated socioculturally, not only through the ethic of Ubuntu, but also through what you characterize as spiritual learning and moving away from rights in education to rights to education. Moving away from right to education to rights in education. And also bringing in this kind of political economic reading of these children who are being schooled as being part of the subclass of the informal labor economy in many countries of the global South. So thank you for that. And I just want to also thank all of the panelists for really exciting and thought-provoking presentations. We are now going to move on to the Q&A. As most of you realize, we have very limited time for this, so we may not be able to take all of your questions, but we're going to pose questions in a way that I hope you see some of your questions reflected in the larger questions that we ask of the panelists. So I'm going to begin with a question, and I apologize if I mispronounce your names, from Nadira Shalub Kavorkian, who asks, can you speak about theorizing childhood studies in settler colonial contexts, since you speak from Australia? So I'm assuming that the question is for Sharon. And did you read the new book about occupied Palestine territories offering the concept of unchilding?
Thanks, Sarada. Thanks, Nadira. I think it's your book that you have referred to, and the concept of unchilding, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm looking forward to reading it, and having read a little about the book, I think it's going to be a fundamentally important text. In terms of theorising childhood in settler colonial contexts, I mean, I think certainly in the context of Australia, the legacy of let me go back. I think in Australia there is a particular context because of the failure to recognise a history of colonisation and genocide. And so that failure to come to terms with the past shapes the soul of the country, if you like, and it certainly shapes the way children are educated in the formal education system, and it particularly shapes the childhoods of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. There's some really important work happening around the way in which ideas of whiteness and the failure to come to terms with colonisation is undermining processes of reconciliation and is reproducing attitudes of racism that Talia Abrahamson has been doing. And I think that's going to be really important in the Australian context. So I won't have speak for much longer. Others might like to pick this up. I know there are a lot of questions, but I think in settler colonial contexts, you can't separate these issues out from ongoing racism and ideas around whiteness.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. I think there are a couple more questions to Sharon, but for the sake of time, I think I'm just going to make sure that each panelist gets a question. So I'm going to move on to a question for Lucia, and this is by Diane Levine, who says, thank you so much for this talk. I have been inspired by your work for a long time. You have said in the past that globalization has radicalized choices and narratives at national levels, and this has significant implications for how childhood is conceptualized and experienced. Do you think that research events led by researchers funded in the minority world almost inevitably perpetuate problems? Or are there ways we can form research collaborations that mitigate the world of these problems? And Dr. Diane Levine is at the Leicestershire Institute of Advanced Studies at the University of Leicestershire. Lucia?
Let me just read your question. I find that my intention, my contribution was to sort of focus on the difficulties that research events, as they are mostly conceptualized in the South, are produced because in a way, our research agenda is already there. There is this effect of the globalization that goes into academic structures, and Southern researchers, as they link to the globalized academic production and the globalized and internationalized way of seeing problems, they are in a way very much adhered to a research agenda that's already there. On the other hand, we have very urgent problems. These problems are there. We face them every day. Every day we see adolescents being assassinated. Every day we look around and problems mount. Problems concerning children and adolescents. So in a way we are urged to give political and ethical responses as researchers. Your question, I think it's a difficult one. How can research mitigate these problems? I think I very much share what Tatek has said, that in a way, for instance, if we take the issue of education in Brazil, public education is geared to forming an underclass of workers. So I feel that childhood research has to make commitments as research assemblages and events are structured, researchers have to make commitments about what sort of world we are aiming at, and what sort of destiny as a social, as a country, we are sort of corroborating. So there is a clear link between research and the political commitments that researchers make. This is very, this is very important. This is very fundamental, I think, in this part of the world, in the South. So as we proceed as researchers, we are always either corroborating with a kind of worldview, or we are sort of making choices about opening up alternatives either for education, for children's participation, for children's rights, and so on. That's what.
Thank you, Lucia. So this might be our last question, and it's a question, and I apologize for not being able to ask all of the really interesting and thought-provoking questions that have been asked by the attendees, but we are running out of time. And so the last question is for you, Tatek, and with an invitation for other panelists to jump in as well at the end. So it's Elena Moriatopoulou, who's a PhD student at the University of Hamburg, and her question is around in his 2020 book, Petchitilides invites us to understand education, children, and educator identities through the lens of the commons, very much aligned with Ubuntu philosophy and the idea of the nested I. And she wanted to ask if you can give your insights and comments on this understanding of education through the lens of the commons. And I was wondering, after Tatek responds, if the other panelists would like to jump in and comment on the idea of the commons. Thank you.
Thank you for this very interesting question. I haven't read that book that you're referring to, unfortunately, but it sounds like a very interesting one that I need to get hold onto. But I think one thing that I would say about the importance of grounding education in the values and historical subjectivities of communities and societies is a very important thing, and that is something that has been missing as part of the bringing all children to school project of education for all initiatives of promoting the idea of children's right to schooling, which in many ways has eroded the multifarious ways in which children know and exist and become. And so I think one of the things that educational policies in Africa and probably elsewhere need to do is to sort of reactivate, to revitalize that aspect of knowledge, the complexity of knowledge, and then sort of promote the kind of education that enables, that supports this idea of knowledge that is already there, knowledge that is already in the community, in societies and families, of which children are an important part.
Thank you, Tatek. I was wondering whether Lucia or Sharon might want to jump in and maybe think more broadly around reflecting on the commons, and especially in terms of we're trying to kind of begin to reimagine the field. And so what would critical childhood studies be like if we kind of brought in a discussion of the commons into our reimagining of the field?
Lucia, did you want to comment, or shall I?
Yes, please. Yes, go ahead.
I think in terms of thinking about the commons, I think this is probably a critical moment in time for us as scholars of childhood studies to really think about what this might mean for our field, but more broadly. And I think this moment that we have that results from the pandemic gives us a real opportunity to think about what a changed world might look like. But we are also in the midst of a climate emergency that I think is one of the greatest issues of intergenerational equity that the world is facing. We are also still living with the key principles of a neoliberal approach to global politics and a global economy that is really built around a consumptogenic society and consumptogenic systems. And so I think the idea of the commons gives us a means of rethinking those massive challenges that we face and thinking about how we can address some of those issues by reimagining or conceptualizing childhood differently. I think Tatek and Lucia's points about the ways in which education is central to perpetuating current dominant paradigms and how education might be a point at which to think differently is really fundamentally important. But of course, at its core, education is political and is about maintaining existing social and political structures and existing economic structures. So I think this is fundamentally important, but I also don't think we should underestimate the magnitude of the task, because of all of society's sectors, it is perhaps education that has the most deeply vested interests. But I think the Commons gives us a way of rethinking that. Guy Standing is someone who's doing some really interesting work in this space at the moment beyond childhood studies.
Thank you, Sharon. Lucia?
I'm not acquainted with this, with the work of this author, but funnily enough, I've been working with in a certain way with the idea of the common, not the commons in the plural, but the common of childhood, not the commons, but the common of childhood in the sense of how children discover, produce, and structure their own collective view about, for instance, learning, for instance, the experience of being at school, which is different from the point of view of teachers, which is different from the point of view of parents. So in a way, I feel that I would think that in the first place, children will have to produce their own common, because they've been sort of inserted in so many structures of oppression that what they feel it's good for them, perhaps it's not. It's their parents' view or their teacher's view. So in a way, I think that discovering one's common also is a question of detaching oneself from the others, and it is a conflictual process. It's not a harmonious process. It's a conflictual process. So I would include in this relationality of the commons the aspect of conflict that is constitutive of human relations and how we cope with that. So I feel that childhood generation is about conflicting with, not only, I mean, this relationality is about conflict as well.
Mm.
Thank you, Lucia. Tatek, would you like to respond?
I just would like to add a small point to what both Sharon and Lucia pointed out, which is the importance of really recognizing, because when I think about childhood and then the kind of research that I carry out in the context of Africa, what comes to always to my mind is how childhood is really part of this. It's part of this deep culture, and there are complex ethno theories of socialization, of socializing children, and when I think about the extent to which the project of schooling doesn't really pay attention to the complexity of ethno theories in socializing children, it really kind of frustrates me in a way, because like in those ethno theories, in those epistemologies of childhood, what are embedded are children's multilingualism, for example, the kind of knowledge that they are part of through storytelling, through ways of collecting social memories. I'm thinking of societies and communities in Africa, the majority of whom have a livelihood that is commensurate with a rural political economy, a kind of economy where societies are illiterate, where societies are not educated in the sense of the formal context of schooling. So I relate to the point that both Sharon and Lucia raised in a way that it is necessary to really pay attention to these neglected dimensions of childhood, neglected aspects of children's sociality and children's cultural existence.
Thank you, Tatek. So thank you to all of the panelists for their really brilliant and thought-provoking discussions today. I think we've begun with a really invigorating seminar on reimagining childhood. So thank you, Sharon, Lucia, and Tatek for taking the time to be here. Thanks to all of the participants, and apologies to those who posed questions that we couldn't take. But I just want to remind you that we have 3 more of these seminars in the months of January, February, and March. And you will be getting emails around this. Also, a video recording of today's conversation will be available in the future, and we will let you know about that as well. So thank you all for being here, and have a good day. My day is in the US, so have a